Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to IFA Global Café and Happy New Year. My name is Patricia Sparrow, Director of Communications at the International Federation on Aging, and it is my great pleasure to host today's session. The session is being recorded. It's also being live streamed to our Facebook channel, and the recording will be available in the next week in our website that I'll post on the chat. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them using the chat function along the bottom of your screen. And I will hand it over to Dr. Jane Barrett for an amazing discussion with Ms. Patricia Sparrow. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And as Bruno said, welcome to 2023 and also to our first Global Cafe. The title of the conversation this morning is Post a Royal Commission, the Future of Aged Care in Australia. And I have the immense pleasure of talking with I think I could say a colleague from way back, Pat. We've known one another for some time, so welcome. Yeah. Pat, you were recently appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of COTA, and before it just used the acronym, it was Council on the Ageing Australia, which I believe is arguably the premier advocacy organisation to promote, improve and protect the wellbeing of older people in Australia, as citizens and as consumers. But in preparation for this conversation this morning, I looked over your LinkedIn. It's terrible when everything's kind of public, isn't it? All of our life. Yes. You know, it seemed to me that your career over several decades now has always been in service to the community, starting with the South Australian Health Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services at the City of Adelaide. You then moved into Aged and Community Australia, called AXA, and then COTA Australia. But I've really found it interesting that you've been an advisor to many governments, for example, in aged care and palliative care for the Federal Minister for Health, Minister for Aged Care, Minister for Sport. And then you kind of, had a bit of a hiatus where you actually moved into the field of vision health, which is something that we're very passionate about when you were the CEO of Vision 2020 and advocating for the vision health of all Australians. So this conversation this morning is wide-ranging. It's beyond aged care. It's really talking about the health and well-being of all Australians. So thank you very much for joining us today, Pat.
Thank you very much for having me. And can I say Happy New Year to everyone? And I'd also just like to do something that we do in Australia, which is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from tonight, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us here today, and acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
And thank you very much for Pat. It's really critically important to recognise, our forebearers. I'd like to start off.
Fabulous to see everyone from all around the world. And I know for many of you it's morning. I need to confess and say it's 11 p.m. here in Melbourne, Australia. It's not my best time of night, but hopefully I will have a great conversation. So thanks for asking me to do it.
Yeah, look, Pat, I couldn't do 11 p.m. I could do 3 a.m., but not 11. So I honour you and admire you. I do want to start off around aged care because as an Australian, I've always thought that Australia was one of those leaders in the field of aged care. And I still really think that if we think about some of the other countries and the struggles that they're having just in having national standards, for example. So why did Australia really need? Did it need a Royal Commission? And if so, what has it achieved?
So I think there were mixed views about whether we needed a Royal Commission or not, but I think that the reason that we did end up with one, and in the end I was pleased we ended up with a Royal Commission, is that we'd had a long period in Australia, and you're right, there's lots of things that we do well. There are good aged care providers in Australia, but we'd had a period over 20 odd years where there were issues with aged care in Australia that were being raised. and 20 odd reports were commissioned by federal governments where they raised a whole lot of things that should happen. They all did little bits and pieces. There were little incremental kind of changes, but fundamentally there were still people in the community, I think, who were concerned, who didn't trust, who'd had bad experiences. And there were a number of instances where those bad experiences and concerns came to the fore. And I think that it just built. There was, just before the Royal Commission, there were some terrible revelations about a service in South Australia called Oakden, which was working for people who had mental health issues, and there'd been some terrible abuses happening there. There were current affairs shows talking about the abuses, and so there was a lack of trust. And I think people wanted to know what's actually going on, because we hear good things about aged care, but then people are having really terrible experiences. So the government did call a Royal Commission, and I think that it needed to, because I think what's happened as a result is there's been a big nationwide conversation, and the light's been shone on aged care in a way that we haven't seen in the past. The Royal Commission reported in 2021, and the government responded in its budget that year and put in an additional $18 billion worth of funding for aged care. It's a huge reform agenda. Different people will have different views about the effectiveness of all of that, but what you do have to say is that the reform agenda is large, and it addresses things like frontline service delivery, like funding, but importantly, one of the underwriting things about it is putting a human rights basis to the whole aged care system, which I think is really, really important. And it will also create a number of independent bodies, and there'll be independent oversight and ongoing monitoring and scrutiny of what's happening in aged care. And I think that's really critical. So I think, it was difficult. It was a difficult process, but it was a good process because everything was laid bare. And what it did show was that, yes, there were issues with individual providers where things perhaps hadn't gone as they should, or the care wasn't up to scratch. But what it also really highlighted is that there are a range of systemic issues around the funding and the regulation that needed to be addressed, and that could only be addressed with government addressing their end as well. So after 20 years of reports, there was at least that acknowledgement that there were fundamental systemic issues that needed to be addressed.
It's a tough business though, isn't it, aged care? And just before we came on, we talked about, some statistics that have just been recently released about, the business models, the ability to actually, make a business out of aged care. Could you make a comment on that?
Yeah, so I think, in a sense, what that report shows is what the Royal Commission found, that there are financial sustainability issues. But what the Royal Commission did also find is that there are quality issues that need to be addressed. And the reforms that have been put in place are designed to address both of those.
Yep.
We're still implementing. So, and it's been a trend for some time that there are financial sustainability issues. And as representing older people, we have to make sure that services are available and are able to be delivered at the quality that we want to have for our older Australians to access. But it does kind of show the implementation is ongoing. So some things that might have an impact on the funding haven't yet been implemented. We know there's been a recent agreement to give a long overdue pay rise to the predominantly low-paid female workforce. That's going to be handed in two tranches. The new residential aged care funding instrument has only just come in, and so we haven't seen what the impact of that might be. And this is where this report is really helpful for everybody, because we can see what the changes are. So unfortunately it's not a surprise, and the Royal Commission actually bore that out. But it does give us data that we can monitor. The full impact of the Royal Commission recommendations won't yet have been felt. And one of the important recommendations too is an independent pricing authority starting to work in aged care to look at those financial sustainability issues. So I think, you know, we've got a way to go on both financial sustainability and quality, but there's good processes, and that report is a really good, comes out quarterly, gives us a really good sense of what's happening in the sector.
Pat, it seems as though you have systems in place, which, you know, in many countries, we don't have those systems in place. So I think that that's a positive. You mentioned frontline workers in your opening remarks. Could you just talk a little bit about the difficulty in attracting, you know, workers in this field, and what can we be doing about it, or what is Australia doing about it? Because it's a very vexed issue around the world. How do we attract?
And there are workforce shortages, aren't there? I mean, in all countries generally, and then in aged care, it's particularly in some of the caring professions more generally, made worse, I think, by COVID and burnout that people have experienced. And it has to be said that the Royal Commission probably had an impact for workers in Australia too, because there was a lot of conversations about aged care was terrible and workers didn't feel good about their job. But even before that, the supply of workers was difficult, and it's got harder. I think that we have to really kind of work to attract people into aged care. I think people don't, or they have a view about what aged care might be like, what working in aged care might be like. And they don't necessarily realise that there are a whole range of different roles that they could have. There's obviously carers and nurses, but you can work in IT, you can work in hospitality, you can work in a whole range of areas in aged care, which needs to be promoted. We need to make sure, you know, from our point of view, for older people, we have to make sure people are really well trained and well supported. And that remuneration piece is important. So many of the workforce were underpaid. It's a 15% pay rise that they'll get paid in 2 tranches. We would prefer if it was being paid upfront straight away, because we think people have been underpaid. So I think it is about the training and the support that people are getting. It is about the remuneration and career opportunities. And so I think we have to look at it on a whole range of fronts, and there is work happening on that front as well.
Now, one of the initiatives just recently launched in Australia is the 5-star rating system. Now, when I go to book into a hotel, I immediately look at, you know, the stars. How many stars is it? 2, 3. You know, is the 5-star rating system for residential care facilities, is it too simplistic? You know, will it actually start dividing the community if one facility has a 2-star and the other facility has a 4? Have you got views about that rating system?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, one of the attractive things about it from the point of view of a person looking to go into an aged care facility or for someone who's got family members in an aged care facility, it provides much more transparent information. And other countries have these kind of systems. So it's new for Australia. It's made up of a number of different components, and you can look at each of the components. So while people might feel that a star rating in and of itself is simplistic, you can actually drill down and see, for example, what's the results of the resident experience. So when our Quality and Safety Commission go in, there are resident experiences undertaken by an external body, and you can have a look, if you're a family member, at, well, what are people who are living in the facility, or what are the families of people who are living in that facility saying about the care. You can see what's happening in terms of compliance. You can have a look at the quality indicators. So there are different elements that you can look at. So while a simplified system is never going to catch all of the nuances, this is actually a real step forward from the point of view of older Australians and their families in transparent information. One of the things that came out through the Royal Commission was it's not transparent. We don't understand what's happening. We don't know about the staffing. You know, we don't know about all of those things. So I think it's really important, and that this puts some power back in the hands of the individual to make decisions. But what, of course, we're encouraging people to do is this is about having a conversation with the service provider and finding out, you know, what's happening, why is the score that way? Often providers will have an explanation. Their service model might be slightly different, and that's why our staffing looks different. So I think it encourages those conversations, but it's definitely good in that it's transparent and gives older people and their families an opportunity to look at that information, make decisions and ask questions. And hopefully the transparency overall will lift the majority of providers in Australia are on a sort of a three-star rating. There was some in the 4 and 5 and some in the 1 and 2. And what you'd hope to see over time is that it lifts the boats overall.
I was very impressed with the ease and the transparency that I could access the website, put in the facility or number of facilities, and I could see it easily. And then if I clicked on the star rating, I could actually see what that star rating was all about. So I think from an access perspective and a simple way of understanding the conversation with the provider, I thought it was actually an excellent entry point.
And that's what lots of people who perhaps, you know, people who are looking at what home they might want to go into, or they are looking at, well, you know, and I've heard people talk about, we looked up the home that my mum was in, and, you know, they got a good score in some and they not in another, and we want to ask about that. So I think people are looking at the detail underneath and not just saying, oh, it's a 3-star, it's terrible. Now, some of the information I know, because it's only started just before Christmas, 2 weeks before Christmas, there is some issues with some of the information. It's a little bit out of date. That's going to get better as time goes on. So I think, you know, you're going to have some teething problems, but I think it is. And from talking to older people and to family members who are using it, they're really valuing it.
Look, I want to turn to a more personal question, and it's about leadership and women in leadership and ageism. So you've been in the field of service for all of your career. And how is Australia or Kota Australia being a leader in combating ageism? And to what degree can we be advocates for a UN Convention on the Rights of Older People?
Yeah, and I mean, we absolutely all need to be advocates for that, and Kota is very supportive of that position and will continue to be so, and continue to advocate for Australia to be involved and to be supportive of that development. It is interesting being a female leader, and I can see many female leaders on the call today. I actually have to say my personal experience was I didn't really feel that I was treated any differently actually until I became the CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia, which was the peak body for aged care providers. And then I found in some forums and through COVID in some forums, the fact that I was a female did mean that I was spoken to and treated to slightly differently. It was a bit of a shock because that was quite recent and I hadn't expected to see that. So I've had some personal experience of that. But I think what we have to do with ageism and with sexism, and being a female leader, is we actually need to talk about it, to call it out when we see it, and to look at it from a much more educational way. Ageism's quite, I suppose all of the isms have their insidious part, and we often internalise it. I can tell you a story. The other day I went to join a new gym concept that's opened up down the road from me, and they were lovely and they were talking about it, and they started directing comments to me about anti-aging, and you might be interested in this treatment because you might want to look younger, and you know, all of this sort of stuff. And it was like, wow, you know, why is that just being directed at me, and why is it that it's called anti-aging rather than healthy aging? And you know, why do I want to look like I'm 40 when I'm nearly 60? Why is that something I should be aspiring to? So I did actually have a chat with them afterwards. They were a bit taken aback. I said, do you actually want someone my age to join, or is this your subtle way of telling me that I'm too old? But they actually took it on, and they took it on, you know, really well. So I think not everybody's in a position where they can have that conversation, but where we can, we should be. Our job as Kota is to get it talked about in the community and, you know, considered. We've got a long, long way to go in sexism and racism, but it's talked about, and people do know that there are issues. We've got a lot to do, and they're not fixed by any means, but I think ageism is the next big ism, and it is about talking about it. It is about about calling it out when we see it, and it's about educating and trying to make sure that we move on. And some of that education is for ourselves because we internalise it. And I think I made a joke the other night about being older than everyone in the room, and afterwards I went, "Why did I do that?" So I think we all have our ways of internalising it. So it's actually about all of us thinking about those things and acknowledging when we do that. So I think we've got a role to play in the community, and the rights is really important. But this whole thing about opening the conversation and having everybody acknowledging and talking and thinking about it, as we have done with sexism and as we continue to do with racism, if we don't do that and we don't have those conversations, we won't ever move it on. You do need a regulatory underlying about not allowing these things to just continue is important as well.
And of course, we go back to the World Report on Ageism, combating ageism, WHO. It's self-identifying, it's interpersonal, and it's institutional. So, Pat, we've got lots of questions. So I'm going to call on three people: Tina Agrell, Greg Shaw, and then I'm going to give you Shmuel's questions. I'll go to Greg Shaw and then come back to Tina. Greg?
Thanks, Jane, and congratulations on the new job, Pat. And welcome.
Thank you. It's an exciting job.
This week, there's been a major accounting firm in Australia has released a report that indicates that 70% of nursing homes are running at a loss. And that loss on average is around a deficit of $21 per bed day per resident. So my question is, will CODA be advocating for increases in funding as a matter of priority to ensure sustainability of the industry? And how quickly do you think the government will respond to that current deficit? Because I know it would impact the industry significantly every week.
So, as I said before, I think, the report reflects what we've known for some time and what, in fact, the Royal Commission found about some of the systemic financial sustainability issues that the industry is facing. The government put $18 billion additional in last year, which is obviously being implemented over a 5-year period. Some of those funding has gone in, some of them are still to go. So it's a monitoring. We certainly want to see that the sector, those particularly that are providing good quality services, are financially sustainable. One of the debates I think we have to have in Australia is about how much of this is taxpayer funded, how much are we prepared extra to spend in terms of taxpayer funding, and how much of this needs to be looked at in terms of individuals with capacity to paying more for the care that they're receiving. So I think that conversation has to happen. This is a conversation that we start in Australia every now and again, and then politically it gets shut down because people are nervous about having that conversation. It gets into a conversation about people's, in Australia, home ownership is a really big deal. A lot of individuals' wealth is locked up into their home, and so it gets shut down because it becomes a very emotive conversation. But I think it was talked about a bit in the Royal Commission, but it has to be revisited. Aged care, as I said, $18 billion in the budget last year, and we're still saying that, potentially that's not enough funding to make sure that services are financially sustainable. So CODA will support that there needs to be financial sustainability, but we do want to see the impact of all of the things that the Royal Commission and the government have committed to doing. We want to work with the Independent Pricing Authority to really understand what their view is and what are the real cost drivers and pressures and how do we address that. And we will be supportive of conversations around getting the mix and the balance right between what the taxpayer is funding and what people with capacity are. There's a whole range of things that we need to make sure are in place in terms of, not having different tiers of quality. If you need a service, you should be able to get a service. But for those who have capacity to pay, and making sure there's appropriate safety nets is another way of potentially increasing the funding into the system and its overall sustainability.
Okay, not an easy question, Pat, so well done.
I should say too, sorry, Jane, I should say the other important thing is that CODA has had conversations with its members and with older Australians. And what older Australians mostly say is that they are prepared to pay more for aged care if they can afford to, as long as the quality is good. And that's always got to be, from our point of view, that has to be front and centre is about the quality and the equity, as well as paying more.
Look, I'm just going to give you one more question about aged care, and then we'll sort of shift away from that to talk a little bit more about, some other aspects of what COTA do. This is a question from Tina. In implementing recommendations of the Commission, was there a problem negotiating between federal and state authorities, assuming healthcare is a state responsibility? So you may want to address that, because certainly in Canada, health is the responsibility at a provincial level.
Yeah, and what we've got is kind of a split responsibility on health and aged care, so that the federal governments are in it, but it's predominantly the state governments. So we have states rather than provinces. So there are a couple of areas where that really stood out, and COVID laid the problems in our health system in relation to aged care completely bare, because we'd have the federal government saying with COVID, well, this is the health, that's not really our responsibility. And the state health authorities were saying, well, aged care is not really our responsibility either. And so it's like somehow when you go into residential aged care, you become stateless. And both levels of government were assuming that, other levels of government were going to go in and do things. Now, with lots of hard work and lots of stress on providers and on advocates, I was not with COTA at the time, but advocates like COTA, things did start to get better, but it is an ongoing issue. And there are a number of recommendations around health in particular, around oral health, because basically there's an assumption somehow that if you go into aged care, you're going to get those services, but aged care services aren't funded to support them, and the state health system says, well, so it's not a good enough response. So some of those recommendations are a bit slower to be implemented, and so I think that's going to be an ongoing issue, and it's right to call that out, Tina, and it's one that we need to be really careful about. We certainly with COTA, I work for the national body. There are states. We recognise that we need to pull the levers at both to get some of those recommendations actually successfully implemented. It's the same with mental health and really important things that we're concerned, particularly people in residential care, miss out on. And there's no way they should be missing out on those things. They are still a citizen of Australia, regardless of where they live. And it's not good enough for the federal and states to kind of say it's your responsibility. No, it's your responsibility. So there's a lot of work to still be done in that.
Look, thank you for that, Pat. Just want to make, Brendan Sherlock said all isms are learned, as is prejudice. So yes, quite right, Brendan. I'd like Betsy Worley. Betsy, welcome to our Global Cafe. You've got a great question to pose to Pat.
Thank you, and good morning early from New York City. Yes. So as you were talking about business models, one of the things I think about is people are certainly a critical part, but where can technology reduce expenses, create consistency in some cases, and even perhaps improve the patient experience?
Yeah, I think that's
or
really
the
important.
resident experience. Sorry.
Yeah, and for people who are living at home, clients who are living at home, there are ranges of technology that can be used to support them. I mean, I think it's really important that it's such an intimate, personal thing, isn't it? So aged care, whether it's at home or in residential care, needs to stay high tech and high touch. I don't think we've invested enough in Australia. Some individual providers have done some really good things, and there are some great startups, but I don't think we systemically really look at technology and what it can give and use it to its maximum ability. So I think, Betsy, you're making a really good point, and it's something that we need to do more of. There were some recommendations around technologies and systems in the Royal Commission, but even in that context it was pretty lightly done.
Look, thanks, Betsy. I'm just going to turn now to talk about growing subpopulations, and at IFA we talk about older women, older homeless, older LGBTQI2S, older refugees, asylum seekers. Now, in Australia, I have an understanding that, older homeless women is a growing cohort. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why is it happening, and what do we need to do?
Yeah, and look, I'm really passionate about this issue. I mean, my background is in aged care, and I'm very passionate about aged care, but I'm also really excited in this role to be able to hopefully have an impact in some other areas. And this one of homelessness generally, but particularly for older women, is one I'm very passionate about. I think what we've been seeing is an increased risk of people who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And it tends to be with older women that it's as a result of a marriage breakdown and or people, women leaving domestic violence situations. After many years, they've decided they're going to leave. And they're very vulnerable in that. And of course, women throughout their lives have often had episodic work. And we see, if I think about the workers in many of the caring professions, they've had episodic work and been low paid. So when this happens, their financials aren't good. If they've had a marriage breakdown, they often don't get exactly what they should in terms of, their share, or they end up with half of something and struggle. It's still a little bit hidden, because what women tend to do is couch surf or sleep in their car. And they don't always show up in the formal statistics. I think we're getting better at understanding that. So it's something that needs to be brought to the attention. And I think while it's good to have overarching strategies about homelessness about homeless generally, it's actually really important in these instances where there's a small group that you actually do some specific actions. So what we're looking for is some specific focus on older women, because if not, they don't necessarily get their fair share of resources. A lot of it will go to younger people who really need the support as well. But if we don't actually quarantine and say we've got to do some specific things to support older people who are at risk of homelessness, whose situations are different, I don't think we get the action that we need. So we're looking at what specific things need to be done to really support these older women. And I'm still relatively new in the role, so I'm busy now engaging with those groups that are working with homeless older women to see what are the solutions. Some of the solutions will be around general affordable housing issues and how we get institutional investors, etc., to fund affordable housing. And then we need to make sure that older women who are homeless have got good access to that, which at the moment they don't.
And of course, older women is one of our major themes for the 16th Global Conference in Bangkok. So perhaps you could join us there. We have a number of questions that I'd like to get to. So Pat, do elders get better services if they can pay more? It's a really important question for Australia. So if you've got money, do you get better services?
Well, I think what we've tried to do in the aged care system in Australia is protect that the care that you're provided is equal regardless of what you're paying. And because of the way that we are structured currently, that's not a major issue, but it's something we need to protect if we start to talk about people paying for care generally. I think there's been a slightly different view in Australia around some of the hotel type services, that maybe it's okay, some of those services, people who are paying more might have slightly different levels of care. But we want to make sure that the system's sustainable, but we need to protect going forward that we don't end up with two-tier system and some people are getting better care and some people are not getting care. The care piece is the piece that has to be, you get the care that you need, and there may be, as we've seen in Australia with a thing called extra services, there may be some capacity to, maybe on hotel services or something like that, but not on care.
Okay, and I think that's an important point. It's about protecting, the services and not extending those. So, to avoid the two-tier system. I'd like to ask Jakir Masood. Jakir, are you with us today?
Hello, Janet. Yeah.
Hello, would you like to pose your question, Jakir?
Yeah, I would like to know about the how to address for the integrated healthcare for elderly people. So we know there are lots of challenges to solve this problem. So what's your opinion? Thank you, Janet.
Okay, integrated healthcare. Pat, what's the philosophy of COTA around this?
This is just like for the elderly people who are living lonely, alone. So if we make an integrated system that can help the healthcare from home and in the hospital, so it should be a comprehensive healthcare.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Let's hear what Pat has to say. Pat?
Thank you.
We're totally supportive of integrated healthcare. We think it's really important. People need to have access, at home. We've seen some good innovations in some residential care facilities too, where they've created space for health professionals to be part of it, including GPs. So I think there are some moves happening in that space. So it's really important. It's something that we need to make sure does happen, and that older people get their fair share in the healthcare system generally.
Yeah, it's really a continuum, isn't it? The entry point and being able to actually follow the pathway of the older person throughout the healthcare systems. Jane Carmody, welcome. Would you like to pose your question?
Thank you, Gianni and Pat. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jakia. Jane Carmody?
Yeah, good morning. I usually listen to these from home in the morning, and so I don't have the strongest Wi-Fi, but so this morning it's doing well for both video and audio. But thank you so much, Jane. Pat, I was just interested. We always talk about in our work, and in the United States, we're really working on this hospital at home model and have been since 1994. And we know that Australia, or at least we read Australia, has been far ahead of others in this hospital home model, because we know it's better for older people. They do for people that are appropriate for acute care at home. They have better function. And I just wondered, is that come to you? Is that on your radar? Do you think about hospital at home?
Certainly, I'm aware of, hospital in the home, and we try and get people home quicker with more support. How effective it is, I'm probably not, after 3 weeks in the jobs, completely sort of full bottle of how that's working really, really well. But you're right. And I actually have heard some great things too about the states where they have emergency services that are more designed for older people, which is great. So there's always a lot to learn from each other. But, the hospital in the home has been a big program here and has been quite successful.
Thank you very much, Jane. I go to Dr. Asha Rao. Would you like to pose your question about technology?
Yes, I was wanting to ask, what are the technological devices which are useful for aging people, those who are at home, and there are only family caregivers? So if you can just throw some light on that, it will be very helpful to us here.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
There's such a range of technology available, so I'm probably going to be able to touch on some of them, but not all of them. But obviously, there are devices now that smart devices that can monitor the home and monitor activity within the home. One that I'm aware of that I really like, because I looked at it for my mum who's 95, is a plug-in technology that follows at home what a person's normal pattern would be in terms of getting up and putting the kettle on and opening the fridge, those kinds of things, so that if that doesn't happen, it alerts someone that maybe they need to go and check if mum or dad or whoever the loved person is doing okay. So there's that kind of monitoring, a bit less obvious than, the wearables. There are also things to make, easier in the kitchen. So quite low tech devices, but that have a really big impact on people living at home and being able to open jars, for example, and a whole range of things. So technology, we probably should have a session on technology in and of itself. I'm also aware of apps that are starting to pop up now to support both paid carers and carers at home. So there's one here that's specifically based on dementia, so that it helps people, whether they're a professional worker or whether they're a carer at home, find services that they need, get information that they need. So there's limitless possibilities, and I'm sure you all know some fantastic technologies as well. Maybe, Jane, we need another session on technology and some of the developments. And I've been doing quite a lot of work on and off over the last few years with startups, and it's really interesting to see startup companies coming and tackling things differently from some of the large technology firms that are available. So it's probably in and of itself a whole conversation, and I'm sure we've all got examples from each of our countries of things that have been done in that space.
Yes, and certain discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Jane, I also support this news, one more session on technology, because what in India, we feel that only monitoring the steps or small devices are only technology which is there. So please organize a session on technology specifically for elder people. Thank you very much for your time.
I certainly will. I just want to make a comment. Kelly Hayes wrote a very, very important comment in the chat box. We need to also consider people without children as well as caregivers in their significant role. So yes, Kelly, we do. Tom Mottle from Boston, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Jane. I'll just offer a brief comment because I am a technologist, so to speak, not a device person, but the use of technology. And one thing that has come home very strongly to me, both from work I've been doing the last few years and as an older person, not so much for myself, but for people that I know, that the challenges and the opportunities in digital technologies and robotics are enormous. And there are enormous number of people, particularly younger people, who have the experience of their older parents and grandparents that are doing wonderful things. But in their enthusiasm, it's often neglected that there's a cultural and an emotional factor that needs to be kept first and foremost, because the technology can be there, but it's the old story. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah, look, thank you very much, Tom. That's quite well articulated. I'd just like to go to
studies that show too. There are studies that show too, Tom, people need to continue to be supported. So sometimes there'll be some initial support for the person with the technology, and then that drops, and then what you see is people stop using the technology because they're not confident. So it is really important to give people support all the way through.
Yeah, look, thank you, Pat. Cynthia Stewart. Cynthia, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Pat. This is really so enlightening. But I'm touched because I worked in vision and hearing rehab for a number of years. I'm really concerned about the sensory impairment areas. And do you feel that older Australians are really getting that access for their visual and hearing needs in the later years, whether it be in the community or in institutions?
I was really shocked before. I hadn't done much, didn't have much knowledge about vision. And when I went to Vision 2020, I was completely shocked to learn that 90% of all vision loss is actually preventable or treatable if it's identified early. We do have a good system in Australia of people being able to go to optometrists for eye checks. That's kind of covered by our Medicare system. The cost is in the glasses, and the cost is often, that becomes the prohibitive cost sometimes for people in terms of glasses. But you're right to also talk about sensory. We don't think when older people are in residential care, we don't think they're generally getting, there are some visiting optometry services, but there's, it's great to be working with people who specialise, ophthalmologists and optometrists, about how might we improve some of those services within residential aged care so that people are being screened. And I mean, I think it's been really interesting in the last few years to see the link between vision loss and dementia, that people are more likely and have a worse experience if they've got vision loss on top of dementia. So I think there's a lot of work to do in that. And as I said, I think generally in the community, people have access, although the costs can be prohibitive to buy glasses. But in residential care, I think there's a lot more that we need to do. And you're right, it's really important. And yeah, I was astounded at how much I hadn't sort of thought about what the natural outworkings are of not being able to see or not being able to hear. I mean, the falls risk I certainly was aware of, but some of the other things hadn't really thought about. And just, yeah, it makes such a huge difference for people, and we need to make sure that people have got really good access. So I'll do it because I've been doing it in Vision 2020. Make sure you get your eyes tested, depending on your age, how frequently. But, just remember that 90% of any vision problem that you're going to have, if you get your eyes tested regularly, they can pick it up and prevent it altogether or treat it so that you don't lose your sight. So look after your eyes.
And of course, with the increasing prevalence of diabetes, You know,
Yes.
the opportunity, the likelihood of diabetic retinopathy and other diabetic eye diseases, you know, certainly escalates. I just want
Indigenous communities, they're 3 times more likely than a white Australian person to end up with a diabetic or other visual problem.
You must have read my mind, because I was now going to ask you a question about our Indigenous community. You know, you opened the session today with welcome to country and recognising our Indigenous land and Indigenous people. Talk with us a little bit about, you know, Indigenous populations and aged care, and Indigenous populations and health promotion and practice. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of that?
Well, I think what we know in Australia is that our Indigenous communities, as I said, in vision, it used to be that they were 10 times more likely to have a vision problem. So work has been done. Now they're 3 times more likely. But across the board, the health issues that they experience, their access to services is just not what it should be. So in aged care, we've got some specific aged care providers, but some of the models don't work terribly well for our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and we need to be looking at how we make sure that the models do work. So in home care, the way that home care is done here doesn't work particularly well in a society that's much more about a collective rather than an individual. We've got to focus on the individual, and I think that's really important, but that doesn't work as well in Indigenous communities. So I think it's really important that we look at what are the models that work and how do we support the access. Obviously, the big thing is making sure that these services are community-led is really important. Those people who work in the community, and there are a lot of Indigenous people who live in our cities, but many of our First Nations peoples live in communities, and it's got to be determined by and led by those communities. And our job at CODA and at any organisation is to actually be an ally to those organisations and to those peoples to help them get the services that they need. And that's something that I really learnt more in the vision space over the last 18 months than I probably had done elsewhere. My job is to be an ally. My job is to acknowledge the contributions that they make and make sure that they have self-determination. So that's what I'm really focused on now.
Look, thank you. And IFA's work, you know, brings together vision health, hearing health, brain health, you know, looking at maintaining and improving function. I just want to turn, as we come to the hour, I want to talk with you about what I thought was quite an alarming statistics. 1 in 5 people over the age of 60 are reported to experience some type of mental concern, such as anxiety, depression. And in my work and in my life, this is often dismissed as just, it's part of growing older. It's like, you know, your eyesight's going to change. Inevitably, there'll be hearing loss. Is this an important issue for COTA? And what are you doing?
It really, really is. It really, really is. And I think that, you know, you're quite right that it's often just dismissed as a normal part of the aging process that you're depressed or, you know, well, you're, you know, older and naturally you're depressed. It's not a natural part of the aging process, and it's not okay for health professionals to see mental health in that light. And of course, we all know, all of us around the world, the impact that the pandemic's had on people's mental health. And that's also been the case for older people. And I live in Melbourne, and I know you've all experienced lockdowns. We've had 6 lockdowns, I think, in Melbourne. And in residential care, often the homes had to be locked down completely. People were locked in their rooms, and their mental health really suffered, as well as their physical health. So it's really critical that we understand mental health. And again, a lot of this goes back to ageism, that older people don't really have the same access to some of these services as the rest of the population. And that's one of the things I'm really focused on. We've got to make sure they have equal access wherever they live. We have been doing some work for the Mental Health Commission here around the impacts of COVID on mental health and looking at what recommendations would make. And that's a report that's going to be released hopefully by the end of this month. But I think, again, it is about making sure that in every area of life that impacts on any human, including older people, we have to make sure that, you know, I use the Aussie saying that older people are getting a fair go and they're getting access to the resources that they need. And that's often not the case.
And perhaps you could come back and talk with us about this very important report. You know, the board of directors of IFA is very keen for us to actually look at the area of mental health in our future direction. As we come up to the hour, Pat, I'm going to ask you one final question. And keeping in mind, everybody on this Global Cafe, it's nearly midnight where Pat is in Australia. So
I'm usually in bed by 9:30.
Yeah, well, you beat me by 2 hours. You know, you've only been in this job 3 weeks, but all of your career has been in service to the community. So what is your vision for COTA in the next 5 years? Where do you see COTA putting its emphasis beyond aged care? Because COTA is not only about advocating for those that are in, you know, long-term care. So what is your vision going forward?
Well, it is that older people are treated equally and have access to the resources that they need, and that their voices are heard. So I see very much my job as doing that. And the areas I think are really important is ageism, because if I look at most of the things we've talked about tonight, there's an element of ageism in everything that's happening for older people. So aged care will continue to be a really important part of what COTA does. But I do want to see us do more work in retirement incomes to make sure that people can look after themselves in their old age and have a good old age. I want to do more work on that whole issue of housing and homelessness that's so fundamental, health and mental health. So all of these areas I really want to see COTA, and COTA has been doing things in those areas, but I see them as really important and picking up the things that are really important to older people. And, you know, we've got a lot of older people who are talking about things like climate change and how important that is to them, because they want to make sure that they leave a good planet for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and the ones that are still to come. So I really see our role is making sure that those voices are heard, making sure that we address ageism so that in all of those things that older people can get access to the services that they need and are a full part of our community. So it's just a small vision. But, you know, I think if we all keep working to do it, and as the population ages, I think, you know, we're getting a bit of a demographic kind of push behind us. I think it's a good time for us to be tackling these huge issues. And as we all know too, cost of living at the moment, I think in every country as a result of the pandemic is high, and we've got to make sure that older people are not marginalised further as a result of that. So there's a lot to do, and I'll look forward to perhaps meeting with you. It is late at night, but I also know for many of you it's very early in the morning. So I think we should congratulate all of ourselves for being able to do this. And it's wonderful to be able to connect in with people who care about the same things that I do, and the same things that are important, and the reason that I've worked in the areas I've worked in throughout my professional life. So thanks for giving me, you know, the opportunity to do it and to meet with all of you. And I hope that I'll see you again, and that we can pick up those intercountry collaborations and information sharing, which is what this organisation does that's so important.
So look, thank you for that, Pat. I'm going to rest you for a moment, but I am going to come back to you and ask you what is your takeaway message for us today. I'm just going to turn now to Bruna and Jasmine and ask them to put up this slide for next week's Global Cafe. Dr. Paul McGarry, we're going to be in conversation with him, and he is ahead of Greater Manchester Ageing Hub. I've known Paul, once again, when you're in this business for as long as I've been in, you know, you come across, you know, experts such as Paul in your time. And certainly Paul has been one of the most significant thought leaders in the age-friendly space and in the development of the Greater Manchester Ageing Hub. So we'll be talking with him about age-friendly environments in the Greater Manchester region. So please join with us and listen to not only what Paul's been doing in the GM Ageing Hub, but the future of age-friendly. And as we come to the close of this session, I also want to acknowledge the International Federation on Aging President, who's been with us throughout this Global Cafe. Thank you very much, Mr. Graham Pryor, for being with us, and also several directors of the board that have been with us today. Finally, the IFA team, staff, colleagues that I have the great honour to be working with every single day. Thank you for your efforts, and particularly Bruna and to Jasmine for actually helping make this happen. So Pat, this has been a fast and furious hour with you. I've learned a tremendous amount, not only about you as a person and a person that's dedicated service to community, but also the way that you've interlinked the health and well-being of Australians into the future agenda of COTA. I'm going to be looking forward to IFA and COTA to have a closer relationship, and particularly in the areas of Indigenous, older homeless women, oral health, vision health, and perhaps even vaccination in the UN Convention. So Pat, thank you. And I will hand the floor back to you to give us your final messages to the Global Cafe today.
Can I thank you for having me? And I have seen a few familiar Australian faces, and it's a little bit earlier for Graham, but it's nice to see you on the line, Graham, as the chair. Thank you for attending the session. I guess there's two takeaways. I think one takeaway for me, which is a really nice reminder for me, is that there are people all around the world who care about this, and that we are stronger when we work together and we learn from each other. So I think that's a fantastic reminder for me. That's my takeaway today. But I think the thing for me is, and I guess this is what I'm coming to grips with in my new role, is at the root of most of this in aged care, in oral health, in health, is about ageism. And if we can't address that plague and that ism, some of what we do is not going to be successful. We're going to get so far, but we're still going to find people being marginalised and not looked after. So for me, the takeaway is we really need to unite and get that global movement going on addressing ageism, because I think it then makes some of the challenges that we're talking about easier to address. So that's what I'd like to see in Australia, and also in everywhere around the world, that we need to sort of really start getting people to focus on how we address ageism, because I think that will make it easier in many ways to get the resources that we need to make sure people have access that they need. And so that's the takeaway I'd like to leave with all of you. And I'm taking away how great it is to connect with people all around the world.
And thank you very much.
Who care about the same thing.
And we do, and it's united in a common agenda. We may come to it from different places, but it's united. So thank you. It's midnight where you are, and it's almost coming into Saturday morning. So thank you so much for your time today. And for everybody on this Global Cafe, hopefully we'll see you next week, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, to be in conversation with Dr. Paul McGarry. All the best. Thank you, Pat.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.